Welcome to Cancer 101, the fundamentals of cancer. Chemotherapy. That's a word that a lot of people are afraid of. Or at the very least, it induces quite a bit of anxiety, and for good reason. There are a lot of side effects associated with different chemotherapies. Hair loss, for instance. Another one is fatigue. That's a very common side effect that actually a lot of people don't talk about. You don't hear that much about it. But it's a serious side effect, and your doctor can help you with that, by the way, if you're having that particular problem. But if you understand chemotherapy a little bit better and how it works and what the point of chemotherapy is, maybe you'll feel somewhat better about it. A lot of the side effects can be taken care of, and hopefully, using chemotherapy, as is so often recommended in many cancer cases, can be very effective, and you'll feel better about it if you understand what the point of chemotherapy is. So let's talk about that today. In particular, I want to answer the question, how does chemotherapy actually work? And to do that, let's first think about what is the problem of cancer. One of the most basic problems of cancer is that cancer cells are your own cells. They haven't come from outside of your body. The body is quite good at recognizing things that have come from outside the body. Viruses like the coronavirus, for instance, or a bacterial infection like pneumonia. And when those foreign agents enter your body pretty quickly ramps up and tries to fight them. Why? Because it recognizes pretty quickly that these are things that have come from outside my body, and they shouldn't be here. So it's a recognition of self versus non-self, and that's what your immune system is all about. But the problem with cancer, if you think about it, is these cancer cells were once healthy cells in your own body. And so your immune system doesn't need to recognize them as non-self because they are self. They belong to you. And so therefore it leaves them alone. If it doesn't, if something goes haywire, then you end up with an autoimmune disorder, and where the body starts attacking its own self. And of course you don't want that. So basically you want your immune system to leave your own cells alone. But when your own healthy cells become cancerous, they start going haywire. The problem is that your immune system doesn't recognize them. So they sit there and they go on about their business doing destruction and multiplying out of control, when what you'd really want is to have your body recognize that and attack them as soon as possible. But unfortunately that doesn't happen. So then we have to scratch our heads and think, well, how can we attack cancer cells if we don't have that advantage of them being foreign invaders? And so one of the approaches is to find something peculiar or interesting about the cancer cells that separate them from your own healthy cells. And one of the earliest things to recognize about cancer is that in most cancers, but not all, cancer cells divide rapidly and out of control. And so if we can target rapidly dividing cells, then maybe we can preferentially destroy cancer cells versus your healthy cells. So of course, one of the concerns people have about cancer, or about chemotherapy, is that chemotherapy it's essentially a poison, right? And people say, why would I take poison in order to make myself healthy, in order to cure myself? Well, the good thing about chemotherapy is that it targets the cell cycle. And let's talk about the cell cycle a little bit. Any cell, including a cancer cell, will go through a cycle in order to divide. So there's different phases like G1, and then it goes to the S phase, which is the synthesis phase, and then G2, and then the M phase, mitosis, and so forth. And so different chemotherapy drugs will target different phases of the cell cycle. And why do they do that? If the cells can be interrupted or harmed or damaged in some way during a particular phase of the cycle, then the cell will die. Okay, and so what you're trying to do is essentially poison the cell at a particular point in the cycle. And different drugs will work at different points in the cycle. A lot of the earlier ones, or a lot of the common ones that we'll be maybe talking about a little bit later, attack in the S phase, the synthesis phase. So what happens then is the cancer cells are very rapidly dividing. That's their main characteristic. They keep growing out of control when they should be slowing down and stopping. Whereas the healthy cells are sitting there in some phase, and they move very slowly through their phases, and then at some point they want to divide, and the mother cell will divide into two sister cells, or excuse me, daughter cells as they call them. And but it does it in a pretty slow, orderly manner, whereas the cancer cells are dividing very quickly. And so you can damage the cancer cells because they're going through that S phase over and over again, whereas the healthy cells will be sitting in some other phase and not be damaged by the chemotherapy. And so essentially that's how chemotherapy works, is the cancer cells are dividing rapidly. That means they go through a particular phase that the chemotherapy is effective at, and they get damaged and they die off. And while it's true that there are some healthy cells that also end up being affected because they may be in a particular phase, a lot more of the cancer cells will be damaged and killed by that method, by using chemotherapy. Now let's look at a few examples. I'm putting a slide up on the screen now, and it shows the different phases of the cell cycle, and it shows which drugs are active in which particular phase. So looking at G1, we see hormonal drugs often are effective in the G1 phase, and then there are these anti-neoplastic enzymes. An anti-neoplastic drug is an anti-cancer drug, essentially. So a drug like asparaginase. Then in the S phase, there are quite a few drugs that are effective, and these are some of the earlier drugs were attacking this S phase. So things like methotrexate and fludarabine, also fluorouracil, which is one of the oldest chemotherapy drugs, that's called 5-FU also. And then miscellaneous drugs like hydroxyurea. And then in the later S phase, you can see telpatican and irinotecan are effective. And then G2, there's a drug called bleomycin, etoposide, tenofovir. And then in the M phase, which is the mitosis phase, there are these drugs called the vinca alkaloids, vinblastine, vincristine, and so forth, and the taxanes, docetaxel and paclitaxel. So you may be recognizing some of these drugs. They're very common drugs, and you can, if you're curious, you can find out how the drug, which particular cell phase it actually affects. But the main point is it disrupts the cell in that particular phase, and thus the cell ends up dying out. So many people don't want to take chemotherapy. They're very resistant to taking chemotherapy. They're happy with all the other treatment options, for instance, surgery or hormone therapy or radiation therapy. But they have this feeling that, I'm taking a poison when I take chemotherapy, and I don't want to do that. And one of the things is they say, why would I want to harm my immune system? Because one of the side effects of chemotherapy is it does temporarily often lower your immune system, like your white blood cell count and so forth. And they say, why should I take a chemotherapy when it's harming my immune system? And I need my immune system to fight the cancer. Well, as I pointed out before, the immune system is not particularly effective at attacking cancer cells because the immune system is good at attacking foreign invaders. And your cancer cells are not foreign invaders, they're your own cells. And so therefore your immune system doesn't recognize them and doesn't attack them. Another thing to think about is when you say chemo is a poison, well, any drug you take, even aspirin, is essentially a poison in your body. It's just if you take, it just depends how much of it that you take and how much your body can handle and deal with it. In fact, even things like food, if you think about food, you eat the wrong types of food for many years and you end up with lots of problems like heart disease and obesity. So even something as straightforward as food that you wouldn't typically worry about can be a problem. Here's another example. You would never think of water as being toxic, but in fact water can be very toxic and even kill you. There have been cases where marathoners worried about not drinking enough water during the long 26-mile, 385-yard race have essentially every mile as they come to one of these water stations, they've chugged and chugged and chugged water. And they can get into serious trouble doing that. They actually end up drinking far too much water than the amount of water that they lose running an amazing 26 miles. There have been cases of religions where they force, in some kind of strange rituals, they force people to drink water, especially children who are very sensitive to the amount of water intake they should be having. And they end up having what's called water poisoning, also called hyperhydration or water toxemia, and water intoxication. So these are all terms for basically to getting way too much water in your system, which disrupts your potassium and sodium balance, and which controls things going in and out of your cell, nutrition moving into the cell, waste products moving out of the cell. And so anything you put into your body, given the particular amount, if you have too much, it can actually end up being poisonous and even kill you. And so the reason chemotherapy is effective, even though it's a poison, is it's given in very carefully controlled amounts that had been studied for many, many years in clinical trials to try to figure out what the appropriate amounts are. One final example, Digitalis, which is used for heart problems that many people have, is a very common drug, a very effective drug, but it's also a deadly poison. So if you take too much of it, it will kill you. So any kind of medicine you take has the potential to be toxic to you. And that's why you have an oncologist who is very carefully administering the appropriate amount of chemotherapy in order to kill the cancer cells and to minimize the harm to your healthy cells. What happens in water intoxication is your electrolytes get pushed outside of their healthy limits and things start going wrong. In particular, you start having brain problems from this electrolyte imbalance. There's a suspicion that the famous pop artist Andy Warhol actually might have died from this. He went in for a simple gallbladder operation. His weight was 128 pounds on admission, and after his surgery, something went wrong and he died. His heart stopped, and during the autopsy, they checked his weight and he was 150 pounds. Now he entered at 128, and when he died, he was 150 pounds. That's a gain of 22 pounds while you're having surgery. And so what they suspect, and the family members, I believe, sued the hospital, is that they overhydrated him. They basically was full of water, and that was the actual problem or cause of death. Now, I don't know if that was ever definitively established or what happened with that lawsuit. So I hope this was helpful to you. As you discuss having chemotherapy with your doctor, you'll feel a bit more comfortable about what the doctor is doing and that he's going to administer the appropriate amount of chemotherapy so that while it is a potentially toxic drug, it's going to be helpful to you overall. Thank you, and see you in the next video.